as soon as I get my slide projector out, I want to do a slideshow for you in a minute, and hope we've got 3 or 4 hours, so I'll show you all. Actually, we do storytelling. That's the thing, and we love to do stories from back from the mountains and down here, and I guess she sort of drugged me into doing the storytelling stuff.
Well, it hasn't hurt you any. I dragged him into storytelling for 3 very good reasons. What were they? Well, let's see.
I still don't know.
First of all, he's been a liar all his life. It's not going to hurt him to do it in a structured setting and serve us as a hedge toward our retirement. Secondly, he enjoys himself entirely too much, playing golf entirely too much with all of his old cronies. And thirdly, some of you know that Wayne has been retired 3 times. He's about to get it down pat now, about to get used to it, and I think it'll take. But there's one thing I kind of noticed about him. He was getting soft in the brain. Getting kind of spacey, you know, not at all mentally disciplined like he was when he used to work. So, just to give you an example, every morning the newspaper arrives, and he grabs it first thing. He clutches it. It is his possession for the first 2 hours that it's in the house. He reads the St. Augustine record from cover to cover. And then he starts with the crossword puzzle. That goes pretty well for about 3 minutes. And then he starts feeding me clues. Honest to God, last week or the week before, he says to me, "What is a 4-letter word for Bambi? Is it a lamb?" Now, folks,
Had an A in it.
you know what they say on TV? A good mind is a terrible thing to waste.
It should not be all one-sided. There should be some equality in this preset here. I don't know. Just last week we're sitting there watching reruns of the Lawrence Welk show. I mean, nighttime's excitement in December. But I thought I'd get some ice cream. Now, you got to know this about Jane. She's persnickety about her ice cream. She'll hardly eat anything but Breyers. Well, it just so happened a few days later, I'd seen an ad in the paper. Publix had Breyers. You buy one, you get one free. So I headed off down to Winn-Dixie and bought some ice cream. Laid in a supply of pecan and peach. So I figured, Jane, would you like to have some ice cream with me?
And I said, "Sure, honey. Bring me some of that butter pecan. While you're at it, you better write it down or you'll forget."
Thanks, woman. I mean, you think I can't remember a simple thing like ice cream? I'm just going to go get some ice cream.
Well, don't you remember what else I said to you? I said, "And while you're at it, why don't you bring me a couple of those really good homemade cookies that Emily made for you?" I mean, Emily, my daughter, is a talented cookie baker. Just imagine, fresh, sour cream oatmeal cookies, golden brown from the oven, loaded with raisins and dried fruit and big chunks of walnuts. Why, just talking about it makes my mouth water. And while you're at it, you better write it down so you won't forget.
For God's sakes, woman, I just go into the kitchen to get cookies and ice cream. You think I'm a moron and can't remember anything? Going on in the kitchen, about 15 minutes later, I came back with 2 big dishes. Scrambled eggs.
See? I told you to write it down. I said I wanted toast with my scrambled eggs.
Now you know why, on a cold September night, just this past year, we found ourselves lost. Physically, literally, L-O-S-T, lost. 450 kilometers west of Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, 100 kilometers south of the geographic center of Asia, flat lost in the steppes of Mongolia.
You're probably wondering how that happened, aren't you? Well, our daughter Jennifer is in the Peace Corps, and she is stationed in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. So nothing would do but that we were going to make a trip over there to see her. How else could we justify the time and the effort and the money to make a once-in-a-lifetime trip like that? So Wayne set about, spending his days and his nights on the internet, searching for bargains and itineraries and flight schedules and tour groups and information about Mongolia. Why? It was too important a project to turn over to a professional travel agent. It was a DIY, do it yourself. For months I said, but when are we going? And for months he said, I almost got it pulled together.
So, on an August day, August what, 31st? August 31st, found us taking off from Vancouver, British Columbia.
Yes, we did.
Jenny came.
We flew, and Jenny flew from Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, and we rendezvoused in a place that none of us had ever seen before, the Beijing International Airport. Short time later, we met up with our tour, which was 18 other people, and we began to spend 10 days touring China by bus, airplane, and boat. Oh, but we haven't gotten there yet. We ended up in Shanghai. And Shanghai, I have to tell you, if you haven't been there, is probably the one city in the world that has the most impressive modern architecture of any other. It's worth the trip to go there just to see the buildings that they're putting up there, and especially across the river from the old banking district. Well, after we had been in Shanghai, maybe a day and a half, our 18 friends got on airplanes and came back to the United States, leaving the 3 of us in Shanghai to continue to see the sights and do a little more shopping before we got on a Chinese express train overnight to Beijing. When we got to Beijing, we had reserved a hotel there for several days. It was about 2 blocks from Tiananmen Square and the Forbidden City, and we still wandered around down in that area to see some more sights, and in the process we were getting ready to go to Mongolia. So on the morning of the 3rd day, we boarded the Siberian Express Railroad for a 30-hour trip from Beijing to Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar. Now, our time in China was quite an experience. Where else could we purchase 2 gold Rolex watches for $5? And Wayne's is an oyster perpetual.
Talking of experiences, I've got to give you one quick Sydney Green Street experience that occurred in Beijing. We had decided that we would ship 2 of the Munster bags by checking the bags on the train ahead of with us, so we didn't have to carry them on, get them in the compartment, didn't know what the configuration of the compartments was. And they were huge bags. So I take a taxi down to Beijing railway station. It's a classic communist cathedral. Big, staring concrete walls, cold and colorless. Out front is a huge paved plaza thousands of Chinese staying in it 24 hours a day, I guess, because there's so much mankind there. The taxi dropped me off across an 8-lane boulevard because they couldn't come across the road. I found 2 Chinese on some kind of a motorized vehicle, and we put the bags on it, and one of them walked and I rode, and we finally got over to the railway station and went in this huge open room with nothing but people, some Chinese workers around in bags on the floor, and they were working with them, and they indicated I was to put my bags down here and follow the man into the other room. I walked into a small room, a small office, smoke hanging heavy in the air, worker with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, about 4 Chinese workers with computer screens and otherwise sitting around behind a counter, and I sat down and they gave me a form to fill out, which was very poorly translated into English in a few spots. He gruffly told me to fill it out, and I figured if I didn't do it properly, I'd be shackled to the wall and spikes driven under my fingernails. But I did the job, only to find out that I misinterpreted what it said and had to pay $40 fees for what I should never have paid anything for, because I didn't know whether it was coming or going. Finally, they issued me out to the big building again, and I went around to the side, and there in an open airspace were my 2 saviors who had brought my bags over, and my bags were with them. I tipped them handsomely and bid those bags farewell because I expected to never see them again. Would you believe I eventually found them when we got to Ulaanbaatar? Of course, I had to pay again to get them back from the freight people there. This time, however, when I paid them the money, they made change out of their pockets and their own wallets. I'm sure that money eventually found its way back to the government.
Well, our accommodations on the Siberian Express were first class, which meant that there were 2 berths in each compartment. And while Wayne and I had one compartment, Jenny had an adjoining compartment, which we could access through a closet area that was labeled sink and shower. Well, we looked it over pretty good trying to figure out where the shower was until we figured that the faucet assembly lifted out of the sink and you could use that as a shower because the drain was in the floor in front of the sink. So that was fine. The compartment was beautifully paneled in wood. It even had lace curtains on the window. And we went along pretty well. The first morning after the overnight, well, I should say the first day we spent looking out the window at China because it was very scenic. We had beautiful mountain vistas in the distance. We kept catching glimpses of the Great Wall as we kind of followed the same route of it. And of course it was in varying degrees of repair and decline because the wall that you see near Beijing has been restored. But there were numerous small farms and tiny villages and the picturesque people with their ox-drawn carts, and we just did that. And when we weren't doing that, we talked to the 6 or 8 other Americans that had been assigned to the same car we were, or we played cards, or we ate. So by the next morning, when I woke up, we were in the middle of the Gobi Desert. It was the brightest sunshine and the palest blue sky I'd ever seen. All I could see for miles and miles was miles and miles. And the land was covered with a short brown grass that just followed the undulating earth all the way to the horizon. And all I could hear was the steady, monotonous, hypnotic rhythm of the wheels against the tracks. There was a single line of power poles that followed the tracks for as far as we went. And we went like that for hours, until all at once I saw a herd of antelope running sort of away from the train. And I said, "Look at that! Antelope! What are they doing out here in the middle of the desert? Where do they get water?" Well, before the morning was out, we saw wild horses and wild camels in groups. And we saw sheep in groups. And we saw wolves and foxes, and there probably were some small land animals, like moles or voles or something like that. And then we saw vultures and hawks and eagles and birds of that type. We had made only one stop that day. It was at a former Russian outpost. And when the train stopped, the platform was mobbed by Mongols coming forward to try to sell us things, reaching up to the windows of the train. They had bottles of water. They had containers of homemade soup. They had Arak, which is the national Mongolian drink made of fermented mare's milk. Well, since most of that stuff was homemade, we didn't buy any of it. We had no way of knowing if the water bottles had been recycled and refilled or not. So we just watched the people reaching for the train.
Our first experience, however, was the transition from China into Mongolia.
That is also right. We got into a small town on the Chinese side of the border about 12:30 in the morning. It was the middle of the night for all intents and purposes. It didn't take very long for the Chinese customs officials to get on the train and tell us that we had to get off for 2 hours. And we had to leave our possessions on the train. And when we tried to ask them questions about why we had to get off the train, or did everybody have to get off the train, they only answered us in louder voices, as in shouting. And the shouting got louder. And so the ultimate message was, you get off the train. So we and Jenny's compartment mate, who was a young man from San Francisco, got off the train along with everybody else on the train, and we went into the train station at this place, which had hundreds and hundreds of people in it. There were bodies everywhere, sitting on the floor, lying down on the floor, sitting on the available benches. I know that there must have been all the people from our train, all the people from the southbound train, which gets in there about the same time, and everybody from 10 miles around who was a curiosity seeker that wanted to come and look at the foreigners that had to get off the train. So we decided to walk to a nearby hotel cafe where we could sit down and have a cold drink. When we got there, the staff at the hotel was watching an American-made kung fu movie on a widescreen TV with subtitles in Chinese. But they were very cheerful. They paused the DVD and waited on us. And then they would stop for any other stragglers that came in.
You wonder why we stopped for 2 hours in the dead mid of night in this small border town. The reason is very simple. Mongolia and Russia are the only two countries in the world that have a different gauge rail track from all the others. And so it was necessary that we got off the train went to the big warehousing area where the cars are lifted off the ground, the bogies as they're called, the wheels underneath, the bogies are then rolled up from under the car, a new set of bogies that are a different width come under the car sits back down on the bogies, and they do the entire train this way before we can continue the trip. We had one of the unique experiences because everything we had ever read and heard said that everyone had to get off the train when you hit this border. And we did, except when we came back to Beijing on the train later, after we finished our visit in Mongolia. Lo and behold, they left everybody on the train. And we stayed on the train as they raised the cars, changed the bogies, and put us back down on the wheels.
And on the track next to us, there were people in other train cars, and we were looking at them, and they were looking at us while they raised their car, and we could see what they were doing, and they were watching us.
And so it was, we made our way to Ulaanbaatar.
That's right, we did. And while Wayne and Jenny liberated our baggage, I stood out on the platform and got what you might call a stellar sunburn, because I sunburn very easily. But I only mention that from the standpoint that the next morning when we got out of bed, we stayed at Jenny's apartment for 3 weeks off and on while we were in Mongolia. And the next morning when I got up, there was 4 to 6 inches of snow on the ground. So Mongolia is indeed a land of sudden extremes.
And on the 7th day, we got lost. We had acquired the services of a stellar Mongolian guide who had a very reliable Toyota Land Rover type vehicle. And we were going to the central part of the country, some 450 kilometers to the west. I must tell you very quickly, Mongolia has 2 entry points into this massive nation, one on the Russian border and the one we crossed on the Chinese border. The only 2 entrance and exit points in the entire country. There are also 2 paved roads in the country. One goes east and west, and one goes theoretically north and south. I say paved because sometimes paved is not the proper description. You'll be driving along and there'll be sections 300 or 400 yards long which will have nothing but just deep pits in it. The concrete is all gone. In fact, many times we see vehicles out in the steppes driving parallel to the paved road because they make better time than driving on the paved road. So these are the conditions. We're going to go 450 kilometers. A gentleman who Jenny is well aware of has invited us to spend the weekend at his gear camp. Gears being those huge round tents that are felt, lined with felt, in which the nomads live. So we were going to experience this. The camp was some 70 kilometers away from Hohoren. Now Hohoren is the ancient capital of Mongolia, and it was the place where Genghis Khan made his headquarters when he was the most barbarous leader in world history, probably. And so we were going to see not only the ancient capital of Hohoren, but see the great monastery that's nearby and have a wonderful time exploring that, and then go on some 70 kilometers further out into the middle of the steppes to spend the weekend at this gear camp. We ended our, quote, paved road at Hohoren, and then we were on an unimproved road for about 30 kilometers, in which time it then turned into 2 tracks. And that's the principal road system in Mongolia. 2 tracks that go across the country. Many times those 2 tracks will come to an intersection with 4 other sets of 2 tracks. No signs, and only the well-educated local native with his sense of direction knows which one of those sets of tracks to come out of on the other side. Well, lo and behold, we were following a wonderful afternoon of seeing the magnificent, wild openness of the steppes. We had stopped at one location to enjoy nature and take a break for nature, which, by the way, politely said, is not the most private thing in the world in Mongolia.
No, it's not, because there's not a tree to hide behind, or a bush big enough to squat down behind.
And so it is.
But to use my daughter Jennifer's vernacular, I learned to pop a squat anywhere.
And that's
And not
exactly
only
what you did.
that, that's right. At one point, I popped a squat right next to a herd of wild camels, and they all turned and looked at me. Have you ever had 20 camels look at you with big brown eyes and those eyelashes? Like, what are you doing, human?
And there is, the modesty goes out the window, but people are very cognizant of it.
Respectful.
You get a van load of 30 people going across country, and they'll stop 4 or 5 women to run out 20 yards one way, and men will go 20 yards the other way, and they turn their backs to each other and pop a squat. So,
Well, one thing I learned, though, you have to judge the wind. We don't think about things like that in America. We haven't been trained on how to gauge the wind.
so it is that we started our trip to Hohoren. And we made the trip uneventually till we got to Hohoren, and from there, as I said, we were on an improved road, non-paved, until we got to the point where we then went into tracks. And eventually, as the day began to end, and it came closer to sundown, we realized, and the driver did, And let me back up. Jenny, our daughter, does speak enough Mongolian that we had some communications availability. He was lost. We couldn't find our way. So we started using GPS, GER positioning system. We'd go until we saw a ger over here, and we'd stop and we'd ask where this camp is. And they kept giving us directions until eventually it was getting late in the afternoon, and it was quite obvious we were having some problems. Until we finally saw this one ger that had two vehicles out front. So our driver turned and took out across the steps, no road, just headed toward the ger camp, the ger. And when we arrived there, we were greeted by an elderly gentleman who was the patriarch of the family, and he quickly acknowledged that yes, we were lost. We were on the wrong side of the mountain range. We should be on the other side of the range of mountains. And he also advised that we'd never find our way, even our driver would not, because the trail was so poorly marked that there was no way in the dusk of the afternoon we could get it. But he volunteered his son to lead the way in his vehicle. Then he asked us to come in and join him. I must tell you that we had one of the great experiences I've ever had, because we got out of the car, went into this ger, where we were met by some 12 or 13 members of the family, and the four of us. We sat in the customs of the country at the head of the ger, which is at the north side of it, and there's a very definite protocol about how you move around in these. And we sat, and the patriarch then handed to us a toast. Everybody drinks out of the same cup. He pours the arrig in it, and he hands it to you. You accept it. You're supposed to drink all of it, but if you can't drink all of it, you must take just at least one sip.
You accept it with your right hand.
Yes, always with your right hand, because your left hand is used, well, you take it, everybody, the custom is you use your right hand. After you've sipped, it goes back, he refills it, passes it to the next person. After we finish drinking arrig, which is fermented horse milk, then we have to take toasts and vodka, Mongolian vodka, which is very prevalent in the country. And then we also were offered some of the delicacies, the dried curd or whey made from yak milk, which is not the most
They dry it on the roof of the ger, and it looks like little things that have died.
But we had a chance to enjoy the real, true customs and traditions of a nomadic family in their environment.
That's right. And they were really getting warmed up to swapping the vodka toast with us. This is something we found out. Toasts come in groups of 3. You don't just have a toast, you have 3. And then they want to have 3 more. And during the time we were lost, one of the places we stopped to ask for directions, it was like late Friday, were 2 women. And they kind of rolled over to the side of the car, and the driver was talking to them in Mongolian, asking for directions. And they laughed, and they pointed at us, and they laughed, and they talked to the driver, and he put the window up, and he said, "Drunk."
It put in the arrig all afternoon. So it was, we left the ger, the young fellow leading the way, and eventually we came to an area and went across the mountain range on. If you ever gone down to a little cabin on the edge of a lake through the woods that just you have made a few tracks, this is how that trail was, over that mountain pass.
Rocks
I ever thought in my life that I had a question about my sanity was that moment.
About your sanity.
We were at the mercy of the world at that moment.
That's right.
But at any rate, we descended the mountain pass to another set of tracks. The young fellow said he was running out of gas, but if we follow the power line, we'd eventually wind up at the ger camp. It got dark and you can't see the power line. But we did, in fact, eventually wind up at the ger camp, and we beat our host because he too got lost, coming out to his own ger camp.
Well, he got a late start and wasn't used to going out there in the dark.
That night, after we'd gotten settled in, Jane and I stepped out of the ger. And as we did, something came over us that I would never have believed. Because I felt like I was in the presence of something entirely different, something I'd never seen before. And that's when I looked up. And in that brilliant, cloudless sky in this magnificent country with no fences and very few high mountains where we were, there was nothing but stars above us. I dare say you could not have put your finger up there without touching a star. The power and the brilliance and the divine abilities of the Maker certainly was exhibited on that night. But the coup de grace was when all of a sudden I looked up and realized from horizon to horizon, it looked as if someone had taken a can of white spray paint and painted a huge stripe across the entire sky as I looked at the magnificent Milky Way.
Yeah.
It was a spiritual thing to stand there and say that. You felt you were in God's world. He was looking after you. Probably, you couldn't go to Mongolia, or we couldn't, without going to visit Jenny's host parents. And they lived at Erdrunet, which is a far northern city in Mongolia, not far from Russia. So at some point near the end of our time in Mongolia, we hopped on another train and took another overnight trip from Ulaanbaatar to Erdrunet. Erdrunet is a city that was built in the 1960s by the Russians to support the employees of one of the largest copper mines in the world, which they controlled at that time. So we arrived there, and Jenny's host parents greeted us in grand fashion. They brought multiple vehicles to the train station to meet us. We were ushered into a Mercedes-Benz of unknown vintage. And host father's brother was the driver, and they drove us to our hotel. Then they all got out, went into the hotel with us while we checked in, examined our room to make sure it was satisfactory, took us down to the dining room, and they bought us breakfast. And then they put us back in a car and took us out to the copper mine, which we found greatly interesting. It was the biggest hole in the ground I've ever seen. And then passing, of course, we couldn't stop anywhere on the mine property. We couldn't go in any of the buildings. But while we were at this giant hole in the ground, the employee of the mine said that in passing, he was talking about the mining process. He mentioned something about the other metals that they mined there. So we're thinking, heavy metals? But we didn't ask because it would have been inappropriate, and we knew if we had asked, they wouldn't have told us anyway. So we enjoyed seeing the mine, and then we went to the Erdrunet wool factory, rug factory, where Jennifer's host mother is a supervisor, and this is just a sample of the type of rug that they make. Actually, they make rugs with people actually running the looms, but then they also have a system there which surprised us. They were done by computer programs. They feed the pattern into the computer recognizes the colors, and then somehow or another it lets them know what spools to put which threads on, and then it creates a pattern. Amazing, it really is. So we did that, but probably one of the most exciting things that happened to us the whole time we were in Mongolia was going out to the countryside with the host family on a picnic. They picked us up early one morning. They arrived in their Korean-made van. Actually, the model was called a Grand Saloon. Go figure that. When they opened the door to put us in the vehicle, there were a whole bunch of people in there. There was one of the host sisters. Of course, there was Solko's brother, who had been the driver before from the train station. There was his wife and their daughter, and so there were 9 of us. Brother takes away from the hotel, and we start out on a concrete paved road, which has neither been surveyed or pre-stressed. Concrete roads over there are really interesting. Like Wayne said, you could come along and there's a hole half the size of the car. So That gave way to a more elementary dirt road and then to tracks. And we made two stops on that part of the trip. We stopped at a Buddhist sacred place where we all got out of the car and walked around the pile of rocks 3 times. And every time we walked around the pile of rocks, we each put a rock on the pile. And the purpose of that was to guarantee ourselves safety on the journey.
These little shrines are all along the road at unannounced places. You'll just see one, and when they do, everybody stops.
And you would see these scarves tied in many places. There would be actually official shrines, and yet when we stopped at the pile of rocks, there were scarves like this that had been embedded in the rocks, or fastened to the rocks by placing rocks on top of them. And this is a sort of a scarf that you wear when you arrive in Mongolia. Someone will put this scarf on you, and instead of kissing you on the cheeks, they will snip you on either side of your face. So it's like, which is a little strange the first time it happens. But we went through that ceremony when we got there. We arrived some hours later at a place, a valley. It was the Salinga River Valley. And we drove actually across the grass, off the tracks, till we reached the river bed. And the rivers over there you can't see from a distance because they're down. And the land just keeps going on. So we reached the edge of the river, we crossed to the other side, we unloaded all the foodstuffs and stuff. Everybody packed stuff across the river, across the stones. And they built a fire on the ground. We gathered wood and they built a fire. Then they had a rudimentary grill that somebody had made at home, and they put wood in that for the kebabs, not shish kebabs, but kebabs that they made out of mutton. And they made a lamb stew. They put hot rocks in the pot, and then they piled the meat and the vegetables on top of that, and they poured water on top of that, and then they put the lid on and put rocks on top of the lid, and they let that cook for some hours. Host father's brother, had brought a rod and reel with him because we were going to fish. But nobody knew how to use the rod and reel, and they had loud, animated discussions in Mongolian about how to operate this reel. Till finally Wayne allowed, through Jennifer, that he probably could tell them how they could use that reel to cast. And so they were very happy. And everybody took a turn. There wasn't a fish in that river anywhere, though, I can tell you. And the longer brother went on with his casting, the more energetic he got, because he thought if he did it better and farther, he would catch a fish. But what he ultimately did, he threw himself into the casting process so hard that he fell off of a 6-foot bank, flat out in the water, from which he resurrected himself howling like he was just being killed by the cold water. He immediately shucked all of his clothes. His wife was scandalized. She ran to the van to get a towel for him, and that was the end of the fishing. So when the stew was finally done, they called us back to sit on a carpet that they had unrolled, and the food that Jocelyn had brought from home was sitting out in the containers. It surprised me she had a salad that was made out of chopped up cucumber and tomato and onions, which is very much like a salad that I make in the summertime, except hers had a little bit different seasoning in it. So when they were going to break open the pot of stew, Solko called Wayne over, because he invited him, because this is a big thing, to remove the hot rocks from the stew. So the two of them were reaching in the stew and taking the hot rocks out. I was so proud of him for his asbestos paws. And then they brought this big wok-shaped pot and set it down in the carpet. And then Solko served us with his hands. He reached into the pot and lifted out the meat. He served Wayne first. He served him meat. He gave me a piece of meat. He gave Jenny a piece of meat. He went back. He gave Wayne potato. He gave me potato, and so forth, and then vegetable. And he said, that we were his honored guests and we would be friends forever.
It's quite an experience as we enjoyed the hospitality of the people, probably like very few people get the opportunity, simply because Jenny, in her tenure there, had made enough friendship, had created enough friendship, made enough acquaintances, and knew enough people that we could get a chance to really see a country that I don't think we can describe in full essence to you. But I just suffice to say there are only 3 cities in the country
Basically,
that we call cities. The capital city of Ulaanbaatar, which has a population of about 1 million, and then the city we went to, Erdenet, which had a population of about 50,000, and another city similar to it, which has a population of about 75,000. So other than that, all of the locales in the country are small slums, as they're called, or little towns which have buildings which are basically wood frame buildings with very little concrete construction anywhere in the entire country, except in those 3 major cities that you visit. So we spent 3 really magnificent exploratory weeks in a country that is the 16th largest country in the world, 2.5 times the size of the state of Texas, 10 times as big as the state of Florida, population of 2.5 million people. We've got 6 times as many people or more here in Florida than they have in the entire country. And they just bust their buttons when they tell you that in 2004, they had 300,000 tourists. St. Augustine has that many in a month.
So Mongolia is a real dichotomy. There are things colliding head-on all around you. You can stand on the 4th floor of the State Department store in the downtown capital city, and you can purchase electronics and gadgets and appliances that are the latest in design. You can buy Parisian fragrances. You can buy chic fabrics that are very similar to anything that you could go up to the Avenues Mall and purchase. On the other hand, the clerks that are waiting on you, the people that are there, the people that serve you, very likely live in an environment and a circumstance that is unchanged from what their ancestors enjoyed in the 14th century.
Mongolia, if they call it the country with no fences.
Mongolia, we call it indescribable.
Our trip to Mongolia. Out in the lobby, on that board out there are some things that Jane did on the computer. As we were in the post office in Ulaanbaatar the day before we left the country, someone stole my digital camera. We came through the airport screening in Beijing, and the doofus put my camera bag through the heavy screening, and I lost everything but about 4 rolls of 200 film. The 400 and the 800 film were all obliterated.
So we came home without one photograph
Decent
of
film.
Mongolia that we had taken.
But Jenny, on the other hand, had been sending us lots of pictures. So all of those photographs out there are pictures that Jenny has taken in Mongolia, with the exception of a couple of postcards. So, but all the others are pictures that we have in our photo album as a memory of Mongolia. And these are some other things around here. And after, we're going to be here for a few minutes. If you want to chat a bit about it, we'll chat a bit about
You need
Mongolia.
to show them this.
Oh yes, this I need to show you this. This, out on the steps, the man takes this with him
That's the patriarchal tool.
at all times. It's hooked to his belt here. And so when he's out working, if he needs for preparing his food, and there are the chopsticks to eat it with, and this goes on his belt, and he carries it with him at all times, and he travels the steps doing his work.
And they've been wearing things like that for hundreds of years. And there's still people that wear them. You see them on the street with that on their belt. And then yet you go to the museum where you see the historical dress from different centuries and different warriors and leaders, and they have the same thing on their belt. It's amazing.
Well, we've enjoyed it this evening. We opened up with some stories about Appalachia. I don't want to give the wrong impression about Appalachia now. And probably some of you are familiar with the incidents of the last few days when the Baptist Church in East Waynesville, North Carolina, excommunicated all the Democrats. Well, I've got to tell you, we just had a letter. We have a good friend of ours, David Joe Miller, who's a storyteller up in North Carolina. And David Joe is a terrific fellow. And he sent us a letter, and I'd like to read the letter to you, if you don't mind, to conclude the evening. He said, "Dear friend, I was just visiting Silas Falls, North Carolina, collecting stories when I popped into the local general store about the time the new Pope was being announced on the TV. Myrtle Spouts, the town socialite and Sunday school teacher, was terribly upset that the new Pope was once again a Catholic." Now Myrtle, to hear her tell it, has lived through many popes and even attended at least 2 pope elections in her time.
That's right, I have. One of them was in Chicago, Illinois, and the other one down there outside of Lake City, Florida.
Myrtle seems to be of the notion that the new pope should have been Baptist. I quote her as saying,
"Those Catholics have run a monopoly on the Pope for too long. It's time they let somebody else have the position."
Now, Ophelia Higgsbutt seems to see it in a different light. She says that a Baptist Pope just wouldn't be proper. The Pope needs to be
worldly.
She therefore recommended that we select an Episcopalian or perhaps a Lutheran. Myrtle chimed in saying,
"Well, you can't get more worldly than Jimmy Swaggart or Pat Robinson."
Ophelia just grinned and she said,
"Well, the Lutherans get around more than the Baptists do."
Me, I just left the store shaking my head. What's done is done, I thought, at least for the next 4 years. Or do they elect those guys for 6 years?
Well, that's the news from Silas Falls, North Carolina.
David J. Miller and the Storytelling Church.